Thanks. Yes, so as Katie said, we've actually been working on a Google Doc taking notes throughout the day. We've written about 3,500 words. So we've basically got a policy brief written by about 30 people, none of whom we're going to credit. But we're going to write this up and share it around. I sort of came up with this rough schematic of, I think, where we might have come to consensus on the ideas that we're discussing about where financing comes from, which I wanted to see if it rings true with people. That we in the old days, we did the whole subsidy approach of giving people toilets. And then we said that doesn't work because they don't use them. So then there was CLTS, and we identified there was willingness for people to invest. But CLTS is never going to get you transport and treatment and reuse. And so I think where we've got to now is the role of, there is this willingness to pay, there is this demand generation side. You can use reuse and private sector things to recover some of the costs involved in the value chain. But there's always going to be a bit in the middle, particularly for the poorest, where subsidy and public investment and the enabling environment comes into play. And I wanted to sort of get a sense in the room if this is a fair reflection of where we are with sanitation financing in going forward from this point in the value chain. Does anyone think this is a ridiculous sort of? It's a bit simplistic because I just did it just now. But does it reflect a mood?
I think it's a good start, but it's subsidy plus incentive plus an enabling environment plus.
But big. I was sort of using it as a proxy for role for government, I suppose. But yeah, take your point. Well taken.
I would like to see it as kind of, we've done CLTS, now we've moved on.
We've added to it, I think, was what I was trying to get to.
I think the point is that in urban contexts, we're still really learning what it means to try to generate collective behaviour change at scale. It's a huge challenge, and it requires all the other things to be in place to be able to meet a demand that you might be creating with a process like CLTS adapted for urban contexts.
Okay.
So I think you're right. I think it's fine. It's just.
So could use work.
We did CLTS, and now we know about that, and we've moved on.
Okay.
I think it's still very, very much a work in progress that we're learning about what it means to generate and understand willingness to pay and collective behaviour.
Thanks. I think that's helpful. I think what the thing that I'm trying to really articulate is that there isn't a solution. No one's suggested a solution where the private sector fixes the sanitation problem for us, or where you get, where that's all there is to it. So it's kind of bringing together the role of the private sector, the role of demand generation, and the role of the state into one model, I think. And that's what we need to be working towards together, perhaps, is the way to put it.
And what you don't have on this graph, which I heard, from Jonathan, is supply side support and access to finance. So all of this needs to be integrated. One question I had on that to Lucy was the source of the subsidy, because in your model, with the municipality giving a source, a subsidy. I think we really need to think about this over the long term and how these kind of subsidies can be phased out as well in the context of tightening regulation, which is one of the things you've mentioned. And I think that is something that should also figure in the description of the enabling environment, because there's a tendency to think about policy or but the nitty-gritty of regulation is often forgotten.
Thank you. Okay, we can work that up and share it around.
I think Kathy.
Oh, sorry.
Kathy?
That's right.
Okay, so we'll take that as a starting point. So some hypothetical suggestions that we might want to take forward. Starting from the point that I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Made, but we're looking forward to universal access to safely managed services by 2030. That's the goal for the SDGs. And so, safely managed. What does that mean? That's not just not just a pit latrine. So it's much bigger than that. What type of mix of providers and stakeholders does that involve? How do we get there? Some consensus thoughts that seem to run through the day. NGOs need to change, and a lot of them are already in the process of changing. I think it's not a kind of exhortation. I think it's an observation that NGOs are trying different things and trying to be playing a different role. There is an inescapable role for public finance and government regulation and those that role, but there is also willingness to pay, and partial commercial cost recovery is possible in the right context. And then what can donors do? Well, we've had DFID here nearly all day, which is fantastic. Hi, Simon. Paying close attention. And so, we would think, what someone was saying, what can you do in the next 6 months? So, drawing on potential conclusions from what we've said, what do people think about these proposals? That there could be more financing for technical assistance to the enabling environment, to building the regulatory environment in the right context, to building the supportive structures. That more directing programming towards district and citywide programs that combine demand and supply. Not insisting on a private sector solution, but on a system building approach that integrates market analysis with the other elements of the supply value chain and costs that we've already all discussed today. Perhaps taking a less kind of beneficiary approach, looking at I've put it here as emergent results, so not counting how many people you've got working as pit emptiers, so that you don't have to pit back winners, I think Lucy said, but looking at how you've actually, whether you're incentivizing a more dynamic market sector. I've put a note there that from, I think, I can't remember if Sophie mentioned it, but we were told yesterday the average age of refugee camp is 15 years. Is humanitarian funding realistic in its timescales? Should we acknowledge that at the outset and actually say, we're going to be here for a long time, even if it's a temporary camp, and actually fund that in that way? So there's some potential. These could be recommendations to DFID, but does that reflect the discussion? Do those look sensible, achievable, useful from DFID's point of view? Thoughts, comments, corrections? Or we can just leave it and go home. Jonathan.
I think we should take it a little bit further and try and be more specific to certain context. So, whereas I don't have any, I think there are some good things coming out here, but I think as we move forward, we need to be thinking in terms of what are the specific recommendations for a certain, certain context. So whether we're thinking, are we talking about a protracted crisis, or are we talking about a more stable situation? If we think about India, well, we're not suffering from a protracted sort of conflict crisis there, but there are issues of cyclic flooding, different countries. I think I always find it hard when we're thinking about sort of recommendations unless they're within context of a certain nation, certain state, or a number of states that have some commonalities between them. So that'd be my suggestion.
We await your written recommendations. Mansour?
I think it's really reflects what we discussed, but if we really like to change things on the ground for people we work for, we need to hit both sides. So one is the policy and the other the program. I feel this really helps a lot in policy, and donors like DFID will not at all have a problem using this as a reference in their future policy statements and all that, and that's, again, we can have a credit for that. But if we are really interested in changing things on the ground, then I would suggest we also hit the programming side, which is always challenging for NGOs, because internally they never, in my opinion, they never agree much on that. So I would suggest we do a bit of research and see where are those programming openings are, or possibilities where we can say, DFID, this is your program, this is 60 million, can you take this into that? PPA, big pot, START, there are lots of things there. And unless you hit that, I feel it remains a knowledge product, unfortunately. So but that's what my always desire is, that we hit it a bit hard.
Okay. There's a lady at the back. Oh, sorry. You wanted to speak yourself.
Is it me? Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up are we looking at a stable situation? Speaking about sub-Saharan Africa, we certainly aren't. My own research on urbanisation in Tanzania shows urban populations are growing about 5% per annum and are likely to continue to do so for a considerable time to come. This is particularly small towns, although regional capitals as well, Dar es Salaam, they're all struggling. And so it's far from being a stable situation. In fact, the problem's getting steadily worse and it needs urgent attention.
We'll work along.
Hi, just very short to say that, those of us here also believe in the synergy of WASH, water, sanitation, hygiene working together. We haven't much talked about sort of the hygiene promotion side of things. Actually, money can't buy behaviour change. And it's actually, I think, a double-pronged response here of NGO involvement with the markets and so on. But it's the ongoing change of behaviours, of values, to really realise the full impact and the well-being that and the transformation that all of this can bring. So we mustn't forget the hygiene promotion stuff, work with schools and so on.
Mine's a sort of bit of a specific point, but I would really like to see, because I think it came out strongly in a lot of the experiences that people were sharing today, was that people have found in a lot of their programming that there's a lot of value in working with existing market actors that include the informal sector, and I think it's worth being explicit about that.
Thanks. Simon, do you have any reflections to add? From your... We'll work our way back.
I'm not sure 2 mics will help. I think you all know very well that DFID is now very much committed to the growth agenda, and as I'm sure you all know as well, it's really very, very hard to get sanitation on anybody's agenda. So I think what you're doing here is excellent. I think the idea of actually trying to, I think we've had this conversation already, getting the dialogue going with the advisors at country office level is really very good. And I know that you find that quite difficult. Obviously, in terms of actually influencing the partnership agreements that you have, as I've said on a number of occasions, quite often advisors in Whitehall or Abercrombie House don't necessarily see the submissions that you're making. They may well be continuation of a piece of work that you've been doing for quite some time. So, and individually, you've all probably got various different agreements going and different ideas going. So in terms of actually having a collective effort to try and influence this, it obviously strategically it's a very, very good idea, but it's actually quite difficult, as you will remember, Tim and Katie, trying to get the advisors, when you specifically saying, can we have private sector, can we have someone from livelihoods, can we have water resource management, etc. Quite difficult to get people together on that level, but still worth doing. And I mean, obviously, those that came in for our World Toilet Day efforts in DFID will remember how difficult it was to actually get people to be interested and engaged. It's not a reason for not trying. And I suppose there are lots of different ways of doing this. And I think to carry on with this, to once again come at DFID, where we do try and get a range of advisors together to hear. This is a very pertinent time, as you all know, because as the aid review is ongoing at the moment, and so there are opportunities. But, as I say, the growth agenda is still very, very strong, but the dealing with conflict and resilience and the additional money that's coming through the climate change funds, there are options out there. It's a question of making a compelling argument. So, your collective voice and your collective intelligence in this area is obviously very important for advisors like me to try and make a strong case through the system to try and get funds allocated. But one good piece of news is the fact that the Tory manifesto does carry a similar number of people to be reached as the last 5 years. So that there's another commitment to 60 million to be reached, but as Tim and colleagues have noted, the issue of how much additional funding is going to be made available to support slightly more complex ways of working other than community-led total sanitation, fairly basic systems of water supply, and fairly rudimentary levels of hygiene promotion, to a much more sustainable and much stronger impact on people's lives. That's another challenge in its own right. So I think DFID has a lot of learning to do, and I think a lot of what you've come up with today is very important. And obviously, that I'm a big supporter of lots of what you're doing. So, but unfortunately, I'm a very small cog in pawn in big game of life. So very difficult for me to influence. But that ongoing lobby that comes from you guys is obviously very important. And I think it's been very, very good.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
And we should take this moment to say, actually, Simon's been extremely supportive of this event as well, and talking with other people in DFID, and a huge supporter of the network generally. So we do appreciate your ongoing collaboration and support.
Whether it's positive or negative, you never know. I think there may have been a couple of more people who wanted to make comment. Sorry.
As much as this is beginning to look or sound to me like, at the end of a big conference, you're having the document that government sign at the end and coming to that. So for that reason, I'm trying to also push a bit of the thinking that we're kind of, sharing from our work in the morning with regards to particularly partnerships. I don't see that really coming out strongly here. Yeah, so typically we have certain people we work with. Yes, we've talked about going into other sectors, but beyond that, who else plays what other role that would facilitate markets for urban poor and for sanitation generally. So that's one point that I would like that we consider in the summaries. And then also importantly for me, I didn't quite hear us talk a lot about that. And we are keen to learn about how whatever approaches and ways and thinking we're having right now with regards to market development is taking into account the role and the influence and the participation of the non-typical, the small towns and rural areas, population growth really in the urban. How is all of this fitting into it? So we've discussed around a lot about what is existent right now, but how far are we thinking in the space of rapidly urbanizing world that we live in today. So if we can, put that up for some further deliberation, maybe sometime. Thank you.
I think a lot of what we've discussed today here fits into an urban environment which is perhaps regulated or perhaps formalised already, and where government approves of urban areas of dwellings. And perhaps in the summary that you provide, it could be just distinguished between perhaps illegal slums and settlements, because that's the huge growing urban poor market that what we try and invest here sometimes may not be allowed because it's in illegal areas. So what we do to overcome that and how we can still support through mechanisms we've identified, but I think there might need to be different ones.
Yeah. It's very, very difficult to hold back my temptation to give my opinion on some of those things as we go along. But yes, it's a crucial issue. And so it definitely needs a reference. Couldn't agree more. Does anyone else have a burning? You get special credit. So
burning something. I'm just thinking in terms of markets. I think we recognise that markets are. There's a lot of complexity in each situation, and for us to be engaging with market actors, then, and in some of the presentations, we recognise that we need to understand those markets. We wanted initially to be exploring more some of the sort of market mapping and analytical tools today. I think for good reason we weren't really able to do that effectively. it would be too much to be able to put that on the agenda, I think, and to go into it sufficiently. It did come up at points, but what I think in terms of the UK water network, something that we could be doing proactively and for members who are in the UK water network, and I think we encourage anyone to be part of that, I think, if I'm right. Yeah. What I would like is if we can use the network to be knowing, to be able to explain to others and give information to others in the network about what we're doing in terms of what tools we're developing and what areas of expertise we have. Because if we're all trying to do everything to understand the complexities, then that's not so constructive. What would be good if one particular member has a whether it's a spreadsheet to analyse like as Jenny was saying, let's look at the financing aspects, understanding the financial flows in a market. Or there was another suggestion that I think it was in your summary in terms of Lucy was saying about the complementarities between doing a political economy analysis complementary to a market mapping exercise. It's quite challenging. Think, gosh, how am I going to do all this? I've got to do a political economy analysis and a market mapping analysis. It becomes a lot to take on board. So what would be useful would be to know where the specializations lie within the network. We know who we can turn to. Say, look, I want to do this, but I'm still a novice. I don't really know where to start. Can you help me out here? And I think that would be great if we could move forward. Thanks.
Is it? Okay. you've got the mic, so I have no control.
I mean, I was just going to say, in your recommendations, I think you have recommendations for donors, but you should also have them for NGOs, specifically broken down. And one key thing is to break down the silos. So, this kind of event is looking to doing that, to integrate and to have humanitarian NGOs talk more to development NGOs. And, they need to change their interventions, the nature of their interventions as well, learn from each other.
Cool.
As humanitarian are moving into development, we see that as well. One thing that was mentioned is development moving into humanitarian, but the reverse is true, and they need to learn from each other. Yeah.
So that is a really neat segue. I think we're going to draw to a close. But the role of the UK network is sort of the concluding point, really. We're going to be sharing the notes and the brief that we will develop out of this. Everybody who's made a suggestion of what should be in the brief, we will be expecting to hear from, with the exact text that you want to put in. Because this is how we work. The network has no secretariat. We have our full-time jobs, and we do this as well. This event was organised by members of the network getting behind it and making it happen. So we want more people to join and be dynamic members of the network, taking in a direction. If you've been sitting here thinking we're talking about the whole wrong issue, then join the network and organise the next event on rural CLTS. But no, but genuinely, we want to reflect the emerging priorities of the sector, and we want people to be involved and driving it forward. So you can get in touch with us, join the mailing list. If you're a member of Bond, then you can join on through the Bond website, and we will use those connections to join everything. We can share information with each other. There is the Bond website has technology for sharing, forming subgroups and so communities who are interested in a common thing can share their respective tools and such like. And again, the relationship with private sector, we can be a facilitator of those kind of communication where it's appropriate. An open invitation, and really keen to see you all at the next one of these in not too soon. The final thing to add is just to say thanks once again to ODI and to Julian in particular for fantastic support in getting all this happen. It really doesn't happen automatically, it turns out. Round of applause.